That's the first answer to your question. The second answer to your question is I don't know. Because you asked, what are we going to do to replace the Federal Reserve? I have read in depth at least 7 well-organized, well-thought-out, well-put-together things from different organizations that have been working on this problem for decades. They all have very good solutions. They differ really in implementation, timeframes, most of the details. But they all work, they're all logical, they've all been put together by some of the best economists and minds that exist. And so I think that any one of them, or amalgamation of all of them, we're not going to determine what replaces the Fed. We're simply going to throw a roadblock into them continuing to work business as usual. It'll ultimately be, panels and people who will come together and go, okay, well, if we're going to phase the Fed out, what are we going to put into its place? I think it'll be a fantastic public forum. I mean, it'll be some of the greatest awakening you could ever have among the American people as that discussion rolls forward. So I look forward to being part of that solution, but I can't sit here today and tell you, well, this is what we're going to do, because I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I have a secondary response to that. There actually is enough gold if you wanted to, but it would have to be valued at about $48,000 an ounce. So, I mean, so technically, I mean, if we keep it the way it is, yeah, $48,000 an ounce, you'd have enough to back all of our currency. But that's feasible. But what would probably happen is I think that if the Fed did get abolished, or even if the Fed doesn't get abolished, you just have a currency that collapses, and the IMF comes in, the global elite comes in, the internationals come in, and they revalue your currency. I mean, our currency might be revalued to 50% of what it's valued at now, which means all of our assets, if we have 100,000 in the bank, it's now worth 50,000 tomorrow. And that's what they're doing in Greece. All the Greece bondholders are getting paid back maybe 30 to 40% of what they had invested. The IMF is revaluing their debt. And so at that point, it's like, okay, yeah, now we're getting to a more reasonable level, maybe $12, $15, $18,000 an ounce for gold. So, or you could do some kind of a partial backing. It might not have to be full. Anything that would actually put the brakes on this massive amounts of just printing without discretion would slow things down and be a step in the right direction. Now, ultimately, I think you would want a one-to-one conversion. You can't print $1 unless you have $1 worth of gold back. That would be perfect. That's how it happened up until 1913. And if you look at charts, it's like, oh, there wasn't massive amounts of inflation up until that point. But sadly, there has never been a fiat currency ever in the history of the world that survived. Ever. Those are pretty tough odds to try to overcome. Ever. And so what is on the back end? I don't know. It would be nice if we just had a government-run printing office that actually printed enough money for the tax revenues that we bring in, and not all this extra flow. But when we get to that point, that'll be a fun hurdle to jump, and actually, like Dr. Davis was saying, come up with a good idea. Right now, we're just used to this kind of a system. There really isn't a good solution unless you value gold at $48,000 an ounce, which would make all gold owners in the world very happy.
Thank you.
I have one more thing I wanted to add, and this is one of those things that is more theoretical, but I'd like for everybody here to have this as a take-home because it is an intriguing idea. And in the dozens of economists that I've interviewed, I've asked them all this one question. I actually haven't asked Kirk this question yet, but I'm interested to get his take. One of the things we need to think about, something that we've grown up with and totally used to, and this is so far outside the box. But again, I'm an inventor. I have 350 patents. I'm an outside-the-box kind of a guy, so that's the way my mind thinks. So excuse me for this, but why is there debt at all? Think about that. Why is there debt at all? Why do you have to go into debt? Why couldn't you just have a system where the government was like truly Uncle Sam, a good uncle, who you had a trust fund set aside, and if you made $50,000 through your earnings, he simply said, well, I'll give you 10 to 1 on everything that you actually earn. And so you can go out and buy a house. No debt. I'm simply going to, just like the good uncle, I'm just going to issue you a check. Here's $500,000 to match your 50 that you actually earned. Now go buy your house. Intriguing idea. I know it sounds off the wall, but I'm going to let that stew with you for a while. One of these days you're going to wake up in the middle of the night in deep sweat and go, oh my God, he's right. Anyway.
Well, let me answer that why there's debt, because we have the freedom of contract, and a debtor can make a contract with a creditor. And let me just also play devil's advocate from the perspective of the managerial elite regarding suing the Fed. There was a similar episode in the 1860s when the United States government in Reconstruction was flagrantly violating the writ of habeas corpus. And one of the more famous cases, the McCarter case, when they knew that Reconstruction was on the verge of being declared unconstitutional, aka the Federal Reserve being defeated judicially, the Congress, which is within its prerogatives, simply withdrew the jurisdiction of reviewing those cases. So the Congress could actually pass a law, and this would be a federal issue, saying that the federal courts don't have jurisdiction over the Fed, and it's a political question, and the court, even if they had jurisdiction, could simply say that under the political question doctrine, the issue is non-justiciable. So there are some hurdles, and the government's been there and done that. I'm not saying it's not going to work, but what I am saying is that there's a track record that these people in Washington, they have a response for every question. It's like a chess game, and they're thinking several moves in advance. So the jurisdiction question, which is controlled by the United States Congress over the federal courts. Secondly, the political doctrine question, where the courts can simply say, and this ultimately will be decided by the United States Supreme Court, if they maintain the jurisdiction, that it's a political question, and that the litigants don't have standing in the courts. They have to go back to the political branches. So that's something that you might want to think about also.
My question was partially answered, but recognizing that monetary policy on the part of the Fed, namely keeping interest rates artificially low for so long, at least partly caused the current economic crisis. Looking at it from the Friedman camp, the part of the role of the Fed is to periodically disturb the economy by reining in the money supply and keeping inflation in check. Without the Federal Reserve, and assuming that we only have partial that, as you mentioned, by precious metals, what instrument do you see to keep inflation from coming out of control?
The question was, what mechanism is in place in order to keep inflation under control? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, I think that you have to ask yourself the fundamental question. Do you want a private banking cartel in control over monetary policy? That's number one. If the answer is no, then you're going to have to find, as I've said, some kind of an alternative to that. Clearly, part of the alternative is ways and means of measuring our economic output. And if you look at the government's track record since time immemorial, and vis-a-vis or versus the way that the private banking cartels have managed it, governments have done much better in terms of controlling inflation. They simply have. They've had better angles and better means of it. Remember, the Federal Reserve, the way they make profits is to put us in debt. They make